Before Rome fell, a rival superpower thrived in the highlands of East Africa, its fleets commanding the Red Sea and its rulers minting gold that circulated across 3 continents. It was a civilization of architectural giants that somehow slipped through the cracks of mainstream history books, overshadowed by Egypt and Greece. Yet, its ruins safeguard perhaps the greatest religious secret on earth, the alleged final resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. This is the story of Aksum, the lost empire that shaped the ancient world before vanishing into myth. Section I, the forgotten superpower, rivaling Rome and Persia. If you asked a scholar living in the 3rd century AD to list the great powers of the world, they wouldn't hesitate. They would tell you there are 4 massive engines driving human civilization. There is Rome in the west, Persia in the Middle East, China in the east, and Aksum in the south. This isn't a modern revisionist take. This comes directly from the writings of the Persian prophet Mahoni, who lived during the height of these empires. To the people of late antiquity, the Kingdom of Aksum wasn't a footnote, it was a titan. Yet, if you walk into a history classroom today, you'll likely hear endless lectures on the Caesars and the dynasties of China, while Aksum remains a blank space on the map. How does a civilization this advanced simply fade from our collective memory? To understand the magnitude of what we've lost, we first have to look at where this kingdom stood. Located in the rugged highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, Aksum was perfectly positioned to dominate the crossroads of the ancient world. But it wasn't just a lucky trading post. It was a sophisticated, urbanized state with a centralized government that could project power across the Red Sea and deep into the Arabian Peninsula. While Europe was struggling through the chaotic decline of the Roman Empire, Aksum was flourishing. They were an organized society with a distinct social hierarchy, a powerful military that utilized war elephants, and a literate culture that developed its own scriptures, which is still used in Ethiopian liturgy today. This is a crucial distinction. We often hear the misconception that sub-Saharan African history is purely oral, lacking the written records of the Mediterranean. Aksum shatters that myth. They carved their history in stone and wrote it on parchment. But perhaps the greatest symbol of their status as a superpower was their currency. In the ancient world, minting your own gold coins was the ultimate flex of sovereignty. It was a declaration that you answered to no one. Aksum was the only sub-Saharan African state to mint its own coinage in antiquity. These coins have been found as far away as India and Sri Lanka, proving that Aksumite merchants weren't just local traders, they were global players. When an Aksumite king sat on his throne, he wasn't just a tribal chieftain, he was a king of kings, a title claiming dominion over vast territories and diverse peoples. They controlled the flow of luxury goods between the Roman Empire and India. They were the gatekeepers of the Red Sea. So, we have a civilization with the military might to rival Persia, the economic reach to trade with India, and the cultural sophistication to develop its own writing system. Why, then, do we know so little about them? Is it simply the passage of time? Or is it that the lens of history shifted north, leaving this African giant in the shadows? To truly grasp why Aksum mattered and why its eventual fall was such a catastrophe for the region, we need to look under the hood of this empire. We need to understand the engine that fueled this golden age. It wasn't just conquest, it was a mastery of the most dangerous and lucrative trade route on earth. Section 2, the engine of empire. Masters of the Red Sea trade. To find the source of Aksum's staggering wealth, you have to leave the cool, misty highlands of the capital and descend thousands of feet toward the scorching coast of the Red Sea. Here, buried under centuries of sand and silt, lies the ghost of one of the ancient world's most vital cities, the port of Agilis. If Aksum was the brain of the empire, Agilis was its lungs. It was here that the empire breathed in the riches of the world and exhaled the resources of Africa. Imagine standing on the docks of Agilis in the 4th century. The air would be thick with the smell of salt, frankincense, and rotting fish. You would hear a cacophony of languages: Greek, Aramaic, Latin, Ge'ez, and Sanskrit. This wasn't just a harbor, it was a global marketplace. Ships from the Roman Empire docked here to offload glass, wine, and olive oil, while vessels from India and Sri Lanka arrived laden with silk, spices, and steel. But why did everyone come here? Why was Aksum the necessary middleman? The answer lies in geopolitics. The Roman Empire had an insatiable hunger for Eastern luxury goods, specifically silk and spices. But to get them overland, they had to go through their sworn enemy, the Persian Empire. Persia taxed these goods heavily or blocked them entirely during times of war. Rome was desperate for a detour, a back door to the markets of the East. Aksum provided that door. By dominating the Red Sea, the Aksumites offered a maritime route that bypassed Persia entirely. They became the gatekeepers of the Indian Ocean trade, and they knew exactly how much their position was worth. They charged tariffs on every ship that entered their waters and took a cut of every transaction at But Aksum wasn't just a toll booth. They were a powerhouse exporter, their most prized commodity, ivory. In the ancient world, ivory was the plastic of the elite used for everything from furniture inlays to religious statues. The Romans couldn't get enough of it, and Aksum had access to the vast elephant herds of the African interior. They established a complex logistical network that moved raw ivory from the savannas, up the steep escarpments to the capital for processing, and then down to the port for export. This trade monopoly created a feedback loop of prosperity. The gold flowing in from Rome and India didn't just line the pockets of merchants. It funded a military machine that secured the trade routes, which in turn brought in more gold. However, being a trade hub meant more than just exchanging goods. It meant exchanging ideas. It was through Aegilis that Aksum absorbed the cultural currents of the world. It's why Aksumite kings spoke Greek, the English of the ancient world. It's why their architecture shows hints of foreign influence blended with indigenous style. They were cosmopolitan in a way few ancient societies were. But what do you do when you have absolute power and unimaginable wealth? What do you do when you want to prove that your civilization is superior to the merchants visiting your shores? You build bigger, heavier, and taller than anyone else dares to try. You take that trade revenue and you turn it into stone. And that is exactly what the kings of Aksum did, creating an engineering mystery that still baffles scientists today. Section 3. The City of Giants. Engineering the Great Stelae. If you walked into the capital city of Aksum at its height, you wouldn't be looking at the ground. You would be craning your neck, staring up at a skyline that shouldn't exist. We often associate skyscrapers with the modern era steel beams, glass, and cranes. But Aksum built skyscrapers 1700 years ago, and they didn't use steel. They used single, massive blocks of solid granite. These are the Stelae of Aksum. Now, when we hear stele or obelisk, we usually think of ancient Egypt's smooth, tapered pillars pointing to the sun. The Aksumites did something completely different. They didn't just carve pillars, they carved ghost buildings. If you look closely at the Great Stelae, you see something eerie. Carved into the sheer rock face are distinct details, mimicking a multi-story palace. There is a false door at the bottom, complete with a lock and handle that can never turn. There are rows of false windows, framing timber beams that aren't actually wood, but stone carved to look like wood. They replicated the intricate monkey head architectural style of their wooden palaces, but they immortalized it in unforgiving granite. These weren't monuments to the gods, they were tombstones. Massive, overwhelming markers for the subterranean burial chambers of the kings. The message was clear. I was a giant in life, and I remain a giant in death. But the true mystery isn't why they built them, it's how. The largest of these stones, the Great Stelae of Aksum, is the largest single piece of stone humanity has ever attempted to erect. It weighs 520 tons. That is the weight of 3 Boeing 747s combined. They quarried this monster from a site several miles away. They dragged it across rough, uneven terrain without the modern wheel, likely using a system of rollers, ramps, and perhaps the brute strength of the elephants they were so famous for training. Then, they had to tilt this 500-ton needle upright with a precision so exact that a single degree of error would spell disaster. This was a civilization pushing the absolute limits of physics. It was a display of excess, confident that their golden age would last forever. But engineering has a breaking point, and so does hubris. Archaeologists believe that the largest stele, that 520-ton behemoth, likely never stood for long. If it stood at all, it appears to have collapsed shortly after, or even during, its erection. When it fell, the impact would have been catastrophic. It smashed into the royal necropolis, crushing the tombs beneath it, sending a tremor through the city that would have felt like an earthquake. The collapse of the Great Stelae wasn't just an engineering failure, it was a psychological shock. Imagine the silence that followed that thunderous crash. The king's greatest project, the symbol of his immortality, lying shattered in the dirt. It signaled the end of an era. The Aksumites suddenly stopped building these giant stelae. The quarries went silent. It was as if the society realized they had gone too far, that they had tried to touch the sky and been struck down. The falling of the stone coincided with a profound shift in the empire's soul. The kings stopped looking to the earth and the stone for their legacy. They began looking toward a new kind of power, one that didn't require granite, but belief. Just as the dust settled on the broken Stelae, a ship arrived at the Red Sea coast carrying 2 Syrian boys who would change the fate of Aksum forever. The age of stone was ending. The age of the cross was about to begin. Section 4. A Spiritual Revolution. The First Christian Kingdom. The story of how Aksum became Christian isn't a tale of missionaries preaching to the masses, nor is it a story of a crusade. It begins, like so many great historical turning points, with a shipwreck. Sometime in the 4th century, a merchant vessel sailing from Tyre docked at a Red Sea port for supplies. Tensions were high, a skirmish broke out, and the entire crew was slaughtered for 2 young boys, Frumentius and Odysseus, who were found studying under a tree. They weren't killed, they were captured and taken up the mountains to the royal court of Aksum, in a twist of fate that sounds like fiction. These 2 Syrian Christians didn't remain slaves. They were educated, Greek-speaking intellectuals, and the king of Aksum saw their value. He made them members of his household. Frumentius in particular rose to become the treasurer and, eventually, the tutor to the young heir to the throne, Prince Ozana. This relationship changed the course of African history. When Ozana became king, he didn't just inherit an empire. He inherited a worldview shaped by his childhood teacher. Around the year 340 AD, King Ozana officially converted to Christianity. Now, pause and consider the timeline here. We often think of Christianity as a European export, something that arrived in Africa much later, with colonization. That is categorically false. King Ozana made Christianity the state religion of Aksum, before the Roman Empire officially solidified it as their sole state religion. While pagan rituals were still common in the streets of Rome, the highlands of Ethiopia were chanting in Greek and Ge'ez, worshipping the God of the Bible. Ozana was proud of this shift. We know this because he broadcast it on the most public billboard available, his money. Before Ozana, Aksumite coins featured the crescent and the disc symbols of the pagan moon and sun gods. But halfway through his reign, the coins changed. The crescent vanished, replaced by a simple, bold cross. This makes Aksum the first nation in human history to put the Christian cross on its currency. But this wasn't just a spiritual revolution, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. By aligning with the Christian faith, Ozana cemented a powerful alliance with the rising Byzantine Empire. Aksum wasn't just a trading partner anymore. They were spiritual brothers to the rulers of Constantinople. This religious transformation went deep. It wasn't just for the elite. Monks known as the 9 Saints arrived, translating the Bible into Ge'ez and establishing monasteries on the tops of impossible cliffs, monasteries that are still active today. They wove Christianity into the very fabric of the culture, creating a unique form of the faith that was distinct from the West. However, this new identity did something else. It gave Aksum a sense of divine purpose. They began to see themselves not just as a kingdom, but as a custodian of the holy. And this is where history begins to bleed into legend. Because if you ask the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today why their land was chosen, they won't talk about trade routes or geopolitics. They will tell you that their connection to the God of Israel goes back centuries before Frumentius, the way to King Solomon. They will tell you that Aksum holds the ultimate proof of this connection. They will tell you that when the empire embraced Christianity, they were merely protecting what they had already possessed for 1,000 years. They would tell you about the Ark, Section 5, the ultimate mystery, Aksum and the Ark of the Covenant. Deep in the heart of modern-day Aksum, surrounded by the ruins of the ancient empire, sits a small, unassuming stone chapel. It is fenced off, heavily guarded, and forbidden to the public. You cannot enter. I cannot enter. Even the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church cannot enter. Inside this chapel, according to Ethiopian tradition, rests the most famous lost artifact in human history, the Ark of the Covenant. Now, for most of the world, the Ark is a Hollywood plot device, a golden box that melts faces in Indiana Jones. But for the people of Aksum, this is not a movie, it is not a myth, it is a historical fact, and the very soul of their nation. The story of how it got here is detailed in the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of the Kings, an epic national saga written in the 14th century, but based on oral traditions that go back much further. It tells the story of the Queen of Sheba, an Aksumite queen who traveled north to Jerusalem to test the wisdom of King Solomon. The two monarchs didn't just exchange riddles, they had a son. His name was Menelik I. When Menelik grew up, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon, recognizing his own blood, offered to make him the heir to Israel. But Menelik refused. He wanted to return to his people in Africa. So, Solomon sent him back with a retinue of Jewish nobles to help him rule. But these nobles didn't want to leave the ark behind. In a heist that would change history, they stole the ark from the Holy of Holies. When Menelik discovered the theft on the journey home, he realized something profound. The ark hadn't struck them down. God had allowed it to move. The divine favor had lifted from Israel and settled on Ethiopia. This narrative is the bedrock of Aksumite identity. It claims that Aksum is the new Jerusalem. Today, the ark is said to be guarded by a single monk, known as the Guardian. This man is appointed for life. Once he enters the chapel grounds, he never leaves until he dies. He is the only human being on earth allowed to look upon the ark. He feeds himself. He prays alone, and he guards the relic with his life. When he approaches death, he nominates his successor, and the secret is passed on. Historians and archaeologists, of course, are skeptical. They point out that there is no physical evidence inside the chapel that can be verified because no one is allowed to verify it. But in a way, whether the gold-covered box of Moses is physically inside that chapel is irrelevant. The belief that it is there is what matters. This belief gave the kings of Aksum a sense of supreme legitimacy. They weren't just powerful, they were the chosen protectors of God's dwelling place. This spiritual armor made the empire feel invincible. But while their faith was unshakable, the world around them was changing. The ground was shifting literally and metaphorically. While the Guardian watched over the ark, the forces of nature and the armies of a new religion were gathering on the horizon. The golden age of Aksum was about to face a storm that no amount of prayer could stop. The decline was coming, and it would come from the very sea that had made them rich. Section 6. The slow fade, climate, conquest, and isolation. It is a comfortable fiction to believe that great empires die with a banger final. Glorious battle where the king falls sword in hand. But history rarely offers us such clean endings. Aksum didn't explode, it suffocated. The slow death of this superpower began in the 7th century, and it came from the very place that had birthed its fortune, the trade routes. While Aksum was gazing inward, focusing on its spiritual destiny, the world outside was being rewritten. To the north, the Prophet Muhammad had united the Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam. Within decades, Muslim armies swept across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Persian Empire. Now, it's important to note that Aksum itself was not conquered. In fact, early Islamic tradition held the kingdom in high regard because an Aksumite king had once granted asylum too early. Followers of Muhammad, who were fleeing persecution, for this kindness, Aksum was spared the sword, but they were not spared the economics. As the Islamic Caliphate consolidated power, they took control of the Red Sea. The Roman Empire, now Byzantium, retreated. The global trade network that Aksum had dominated for centuries was suddenly rerouted. The Christian lake of the Red Sea became a Muslim lake. Aksum was cut off from its diplomatic allies and its economic lifeline. They were, as the historian Edward Gibbon famously wrote, encompassed on all sides by the enemies of their religion, and they slept for 1,000 years. The gold coins stopped being minted. The ships stopped docking at Agelis, and then Agelis itself disappeared. Archaeological evidence suggests that the great port city wasn't just abandoned, it was buried by a natural catastrophe likely a tsunami or a massive silt buildup. When the port died, the lungs of the empire collapsed. But the enemy wasn't just at the gates, it was in the soil. Aksum had spent centuries feeding a massive urban population and supporting a huge army. They had cut down forests to fuel the iron furnaces and clear land for farming. The result was an environmental disaster. The topsoil eroded, the rains became erratic, and the land simply stopped yielding crops. The earth was tired. A starving, isolated empire is fragile. It just needs one push to shatter. That push came in the 10th century, in the form of a nightmare. Her name was Gut. In Ethiopian history, she is the Queen of Fire, a possibly pagan or Jewish warrior queen who rose from the south with a singular hatred for the Aksumite cross. If the Queen of Sheba is the mother of the nation, Gudit is its destroyer. Oral traditions and fragmented manuscripts tell us that she stormed the highlands, hunting down the royal family and burning the churches to the ground. She toppled the monuments and set the capital ablaze. While the historical details of her reign are blurry, the archaeological layer of destruction from this period is very real. Aksum, the city of giants, was brought to its knees. The royal family fled. They abandoned the city that had ruled the world for nearly a millennium. The political center of gravity shifted south into the defensive mountains of Lasta, seeking safety in isolation. The gold was gone. The trade was gone. The cosmopolitan connection to Rome and India was severed. By the medieval period, Aksum was no longer a capital. It was a village living in the shadow of ruins they could no longer explain. But here is the strange paradox of Aksum. The city died, but the idea did not. The empire didn't vanish into the sand like the cities of Mesopotamia. It transformed, it went underground literally, because the next chapter of this civilization wouldn't be built up toward the sky. It would be carved down into the earth. The legacy of Aksum was about to birth a new wonder of the world. The silence of history, so we are left with a question that history alone cannot answer. When we look at the rise and fall of Aksum, we see the fragility of our own modern world. We see how quickly a global superpower dominant in trade, rich in culture, and secure in its military might can simply evaporate when the climate turns and the trade routes shift. Aksum thought it would last forever. It carved that belief into granite mountains. But even granite cracks. The only thing that survived intact wasn't the gold, or the ivory, or the palaces. It was the story. And that brings us back to the Chapel of the Tablet. I want to turn this over to you. Do you believe the Ark of the Covenant is really sitting in that small, guarded room in Ethiopia? Or is the story of the Ark simply a powerful metaphor that allowed a civilization to survive the collapse of its material world? Does the object matter? Or is the faith in the object enough to build an empire? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you want to explore more lost empires that history forgot, make sure you are subscribed, and I will see you in the next one.